Ladies and gentlemen, this is what it all comes down to.
Now, we Baptists cherish our doctrinal inheritance. I want to say this without stutter. We are a people of the book.
Payday someday had become a reality in Jezebel's life.
My brother, if the hierarchical approach to the scriptures dominates our institutions and our denomination, there will be no missionaries to hurt. They will cease to exist.
I have no other argument. I need no other plea. It is enough that Jesus died and that he died for me.
Hey everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Baptist Directory. I'm Dr. Michael Schultz, and today we are discussing Clinton Samuel Carnes, better known as C.S. Carnes, born on the 30th of July, 1878, died on the 31st of July, 1950. In the history of Baptists, very rarely do we have stories that captivate our minds and curiosities because of their worldliness. Our stories usually center around churches, missionaries, pastors, doctrines, martyrdoms, but the saga we're going to explore today is nothing less than a lesson in worldliness. The Carnes Defalcation, that is Defalcation, defalcation, not defecation, different thing entirely. The Carnes Defalcation centered around C.S. Carnes, and it's a real-life depiction of one of my favorite parables, the parable of the frog and the scorpion. To give you an idea of the gravity of this little-known event, let me read you a few quotes from those who were there when it happened, or from historians who have grasped the severity of this event. W. W. Barnes once said of this event, "The defalcation of the treasurer of the Home Mission Board was the greatest financial calamity to ever strike the work of the Southern Baptist Convention." H.T. Stevens once said, "The defalcation of Clinton S. Carnes of nearly $1 million was a colossal disaster. This is possibly the greatest tragedy that Southern Baptists ever had." Albert McClellan once wrote, "Nothing has ever confronted Southern Baptists quite as suddenly and with as much anguish as to learn in August 1928 that the treasurer of the Home Mission Board, Clinton S. Carnes, had stolen nearly $1 million in mission funds and had disappeared from public view." So who was he? On the 30th of July, 1878, Clinton Samuel Carnes was born in Jonesboro, Georgia, just 12 miles from Atlanta. His father, Samuel Gunter Carnes, was a respected 31-year-old veteran of the Civil War who fought under Captain James Warren English in the Confederate Army. The elder Carnes had seen combat at the battles of Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg, and was even present for the surrender of General Lee at Appomattox Courthouse. After the war, Carnes had become quite wealthy and largely lived off of his accumulated savings. Clinton's mother, Fanny Marlin, died only 2 years into his life, and his father would remarry 3 additional times throughout his life, making his home life as a child and coming up somewhat destabilized. So Clinton went through a standard education for the era. He attended school all the way through the high school era, and in his mid-20s he met a young lady by the name of Maud Collins. He begins courting her, and on the 26th of October 1904 they got married. On the 18th of July 1905, almost 9 months to the day later, they welcomed their firstborn son into the world, Samuel Abda Carnes, carrying the Samuel Carnes name into the third generation. Now, during this time, Clinton got a job working for a railroad business as a telegrapher and a ticket agent. And what this means is that at some points he would relay information between the dispatchers and the train crews using Morse code. And this is in the days prior to radio communication. Other times he'd be working passenger trains, checking people's tickets along the ride. And in 1907, he was offered a job as a bookkeeper and an internal auditor for the railroad system. And this job required him to move to Atlanta, and it seems to have stoked his appetite for finances. So he spent the year of 1907 working as a bookkeeper and an auditor for the railroad in Atlanta, while his family resided in a small home in Cartersville, Georgia. They were unable to afford life in Atlanta proper. And even though they were living in a slightly more affordable area of Cartersville, Clinton still found himself in need of additional funds when he and Maud welcomed a second son into the world on the 15th of January, 1908. So while they welcomed the young Robert Emory into the world alongside his brother Samuel, Clinton began to feel the pressure of providing for a growing family, and consequently he began taking on pro rata work with Joel Hunter and Company, which was a certified public accounting firm in Atlanta. Initially, he was given small duties, being a bookkeeper, but he showed initiative and promising skill, and he was taken under the wing of Joel Hunter as an apprentice in 1910. In 1911, he was listed as a regular member of the Joel Hunter and Company firm of certified public accountants. And to this point, everything seems to have been looking up for the 33-year-old Clinton Carnes. He's married, he's a father of 2 sons, he's working as a CPA in one of America's most quickly growing cities. But in 1911, things went awry. Carnes took a position with the Birmingham Railway, Light, and Power Company. And as he spent more and more time away from the family under the auspices of working to provide for them, he began to engage in his first illegal activity while alone in Birmingham, Alabama. Working as a timekeeper for the company, he was responsible for turning in employee hours and issuing their paychecks. So Clinton used his title as timekeeper of the Birmingham Railway to advertise in Birmingham newspapers on behalf of the company without their knowledge and without their permission. What he advertised was that the Birmingham Railway, Light, and Power Company was venturing into what today would be called payday loans, where members of a nearby mining camp could borrow capital against their salaries in advance in exchange for repayment with interest. Now, that might seem like a get-rich-quick scheme on its own, but the point of the advertisements wasn't to get the payday loans out, but he was advertising as if he needed a partner to join him with a $1,000 investment fronting the initial loans to be paid to the miners. And after collecting about $15,000 from prospective investors or partners, he just disappeared from Birmingham. Now, only in hindsight could we possibly piece together what happened. Clinton began working on the move for great portions of his life. Throughout the calendar year of 1912, for example, he maintained his apprenticeship under Joel Hunter in Atlanta while simultaneously establishing himself as a bona fide railroad man in the American Midwest. And to his credit, he seemed to balance this run-and-gun lifestyle fairly well until an indictment was served on him on the 6th of March, 1913. The Birmingham, Alabama Police Department had received enough information to formally charge him with defrauding individuals through the mail who had responded to his newspaper ad back in 1911. So at the revelation of his being charged with fraud, Clinton hit the road. And not only did he leave Birmingham, but he left Atlanta. In 1913, it was the last year that he was ever listed as an apprentice at the Joel Hunter CPA firm. He had been one since 1908, but his whereabouts in 1913 became altogether untraceable, and he seems to have made a series of stops all across the Midwest in Ohio and in Indiana, specifically under the pretense of being an experienced railroad manager. And he began to get day jobs for rail companies where he would run scams, just like the one that he ran in Birmingham, through the mail and through newspapers, and then he would abscond away with large sums of money again without a trace. He did this once in 1914 when he was working as a station agent and paymaster for the Southeastern Railroad of West Clinton, Indiana. Now, this would later become the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pacific Railroad, but this position was almost identical to his former job back in Birmingham, just with a larger market. He was living out of a hotel in town, and this time, rather than simply scamming would-be investors through the mail, he also stole the entire payroll of the employees of the rail company. And he was in such a hurry to run after stealing the payroll that he actually left his luggage in the hotel room and failed to settle his tab with the hotel owner, which was a small but costly mistake that ultimately came back to haunt him in later years. Now, during these riotous years, his presence at home was so sporadic, and his behavior on the occasions that he was home became so erratic that Maud filed for divorce in 1914. No-fault divorces were not legal at that time, and so the rationale for the divorce that was required to be stated was that she desired the divorce on the grounds of, quote, extreme cruelty. And further details went on to explain that while she and her sons were at Cartersville, Georgia, Clinton would appear from time to time, but he would manifest what she called a very violent temper, causing her and the boys, quote, great uneasiness and unhappiness. So the divorce was granted, and Clinton seems to have at this point lost his last real connection to grounded reality. So he ventures off in mid-1914, establishing himself in Kansas City, Missouri, under the guise of being the owner of a large real estate firm that he called the Lindbergh Real Estate Company. And this turned out to be but another front for mail fraud, only this time on a much larger scale. But this scheme, being higher stakes, proved to be more than he was able to carry. He failed to achieve any recognizable success in defrauding anyone, and was almost immediately captured and charged with fraud, indicted in that city. He happened to get away, and he was a fugitive for several months. He was still a fugitive from the Birmingham police for the indictment that was served on him in 1911, and now he's a fugitive from the Kansas City, Missouri police for a new indictment in 1914. He got away for several months, but on the 20th of March, 1915, he was arrested in El Paso, Texas, and extradited back to Kansas City, Missouri to answer for the charges against the Lindbergh Real Estate Company that didn't actually exist. On the 1st of May, 1915, he was sentenced to 4 months in the Clinton County Jail in Clinton, Missouri, and he was required to pay back the funds that he had defrauded from the citizens of Kansas City. On the 9th of October of that same year, he finished his sentence, he completed his repayment of the owed funds, and he was released from the Clinton County Jail. But little did he know that waiting for him upon his release were federal agents who immediately arrested him and transported him to Birmingham, Alabama to stand trial for his fraud there back in 1911. At that point, his ex-wife and his former brother-in-law, a medical doctor by the name of Dr. Virgil O. Harvard of Araby, Georgia, came to pay his bond and get him out while he was awaiting his day in court. And while he was out on bond, Clinton seems to have spent the 6 intervening months devising a plan. When his day in court finally came on the 6th of March, 1916, at the federal court of the Northern District of Alabama, he appeared in court under the name George Harris, and he claimed that the name C.S. Carnes was simply an alias that he had been imprisoned under in Missouri. And so it was that C.S. Carnes pled guilty under the name George Harris and was sentenced to serve 13 months in federal prison for fraud, becoming prisoner number 6237 in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary under the name George Harris. His request to serve in Atlanta was in light of his closeness to family, and that was granted because it was a nonviolent crime, and so he was received into the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary on the 7th of March, 1916. However, since he had been transferred under the name George Harris, he was supposed to respond to the name George every day, and he found that quite difficult, and so he actually preferred for the guards to simply call him number 6237. Other prisoners who served time with him remembered him introducing himself as Clinton Harris, changing what was actually his first name into what he said was a middle name after George. Now try to stick with me because I know at some points this can be kind of dense, but the plot thickens as it goes along, and I hope that you get as much enjoyment out of this as I have. See, while Clinton was in prison in Atlanta, there were only 2 people who knew what degree of trouble he was actually in. I just mentioned them. It was his former brother-in-law, Dr. Harvard, and his ex-wife herself. And they only knew about his situation because they were directly involved when they posted his bond while awaiting trial in Birmingham. So, upon return to Cartersville after Clinton's sentencing, his ex-wife, Maud, told his sons, Samuel, who was now 11, and Robert, who was now 8, that their father had been called away to go work in Washington, D.C. as part of the ongoing World War. Now, this detail will play an incredibly important part in the rest of the story. Bear in mind, the year is 1916. The United States has not yet become involved directly in World War I. That war was at its midpoint, and those familiar with the era will recall that President Woodrow Wilson had campaigned in 1916 in the presidential election as having kept the United States out of the war. We didn't want any part of that war. We saw it as a European problem. And so, We didn't stop trading with our allies like Britain and Switzerland and even Italy to some degree, but we didn't want any part in the war. And this complicated things tremendously because the Germans began sinking ships with this newly developed technology that they called U-boats, and that ultimately led to the sinking of a ship called Lusitania and the Zimmermann telegram, and the rest is history. But all this is to simply say that even though the United States was not formally involved as a combatant in the war in 1916, it was a completely believable story that a man would be called to Washington to assist in the complicated circumstances at the time. And that wasn't just a story that was made up for his kids. That was probably why Maude made it up, but Clinton really took to it. When he was released from prison in Atlanta in April of 1917, having completed his 13-month sentence for fraud, the story that his wife and brother-in-law had been telling everyone, which was that he was working in D.C. to assist with the war effort, was very, very helpful to him. What was even more convenient was the fact that he was released from prison the very week that the United States formally declared war on Germany, officially entering World War I. So the story was all but cemented. His story was, I've been assisting in Washington in a non-combative nature, and I did so all the way up until the day that the nation declared war, and now my job is over and I've returned to Atlanta. Who would doubt a story like that? And even those inside the prison didn't know any better because the inmates and the guards never knew of him as Clinton Carnes. He was George Harris or Prisoner 6237 or Clinton Harris. So when he comes out of the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary in the second week of April 1917, Clinton Carnes has no problem finding work. He got a job at a dental supply company in which he soon bought partial interest, and when he bought into the company, he also purchased the right to manage the operations of the business. So on the side, he again reaches back out to Joel Hunter and Company and lets them know that he's back in town, and he's happy to take up PRN work again whenever the need should arise. And again, this opportunity just fell into his lap because many of the most promising minds in the United States were being called away to war. And so there was a shortage of options for especially the more skilled trades like tax accounting. Carnes, of course, didn't have to worry about being drafted into the war because he couldn't be drafted as a convicted felon. So he didn't have to worry about that as much as all the other young men in the United States did. Of course, he could say that he'd already served his time when he was away working in D.C. It was a perfect excuse. And so he begins to live this otherwise normal life again, managing the dental supply company and doing accounting on the side. Within a year of him being out of prison, he and Maude actually agreed to remarry. She had watched him return to life outside of Atlanta. He'd picked up where he left off. He got a solid job. He bought interest in it. He started managing the job. He returned to accounting work. I mean, it seemed like he was actually a changed and thoroughly rehabilitated man. And so she decided to remarry him. Now, she, of course, was unaware of the fact that he had gone into prison under an alias. She was probably unaware of how much he had made use of the excuse that she and her brother had composed for his absence, which was intended to simply protect her children from embarrassment. In later years, she credibly indicates that she had no idea that he did any of that, but he did. Well, in mid-1918, Carnes had worked for Joel T. Hunter for another year following his reemergence in Atlanta, and had evidently done exemplary work. Not only was there a shortage of qualified and available men as the war waxed on, but Clinton also truly did good work. He was known by those around him to be keen at figures, and Joel Hunter Sr. really took a liking to Clinton, seeing him as somewhat of a rising star. So when the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, based out of Atlanta itself, contacted Joel Hunter's firm asking to use his company for an audit, Hunter was glad to assign one of his most talented workers to the task. To hear one man describe it, it was said that the apt Carnes won over new friends because of his extraordinary ability as an accountant. Officials at the Home Mission Board liked his work. They needed a man like Carnes. Mr. Hunter and others recommended him. So he took a position, a minor one, that of an office clerk, with the Home Mission Board. Now, there's a few things to note from this quote. First of all, no matter what else may be said about Clinton Carnes, he was by any measure a talented accountant. To step in on a pro bono basis and skillfully handle the financial accounts of an entity with a $500,000 annual budget in 1918 was no small feat. And secondly, he came highly recommended by reputable individuals. Many of these letters of recommendation, by the way, are still found at the Southern Baptist Historical Library and Archive in Nashville. You can go read them today. Third, we should consider that there was a shortage of able-minded and able-bodied men because of the war. Fourth, even when he was hired, it was for an introductory level position as an office clerk, which elsewhere might be called an office bookkeeper. So it wasn't as if this was some gigantic thing that was done by the Home Mission Board, but for Carnes, you imagine he must have been elated to take this position, because even though it was an entry-level job, it was nevertheless a career-level position. At 39 years old, he was a man without any real prospects. He had a history of imprisonment, he was a former divorcee, so to come highly recommended and heartily received as a financial overseer for a large entity like the Home Mission Board was a real accomplishment for someone in a situation like C.S. Carnes. Beyond this, who could have possibly imagined that in October of 1918, the longtime treasurer of the Home Mission Board, P.H. Mell, Jr., the son of the monumental figure of whom he's the namesake, would pass away, leaving the treasurership vacant. And with many of those who were in positions of leadership being quite aged, such as B.D. Gray, who was already 63 years of age, they considered the highly recommended and talented bookkeeper who was already employed by the board as a natural successor. So Dr. Gray heartily recommended him to be the next treasurer, and having served on the board for almost 20 years at this point, Dr. Gray's will was done. Now, in perhaps the most shocking move of all, the Home Mission Board did make one last effort to assure themselves and their constituents that Carnes was the right man for the job. In early 1919, they engaged one of the nation's oldest bonding firms, the United States Fidelity and Security Company, and they sought to procure what is called a Firstparty Fidelity bond. Now, this might not seem interesting, but this is actually something that I found incredibly hard to believe. These are bonds that are essentially insurance policies written against a person who is employed by a company, such that if the person ever commits fraud, theft, forgery, or any other intentionally wrong act against the business that's employing them, the insurance company will pay up to the stated amount to recompensate the business for their losses. So generally speaking, these policies are grounded upon an in-depth background check and a thorough examination of the person's work, family, and criminal history. So one can imagine that the United States Fidelity and Security Company would have laughed Carnes out the door. His work history would have shown constant theft and misuse of position. His family history would have shown him to be a divorcee with a history of severe cruelty. And his criminal history would have shown him to be a twice convicted felon who, by the way, was convicted of what? Fraud. So looking into any single aspect of Clinton Carnes' life would have disqualified him from such a policy, and they would have never hired him. But somehow, the United States Fidelity and Security Company came back very quickly, insuring Clinton Carnes for up to $50,000, which was the equivalent of over $1 million in American funds in 2025. As far as the Home Mission Board was concerned, this was more than abundantly satisfactory. So he was offered the job, and he took the helm as the treasurer of the Home Mission Board upon approval at the June business meeting. And during this time, Carnes' family was undergoing a series of reconnection efforts, and one can imagine the work that he put in towards spending more time with his sons, whom he had missed for a large portion of their lives, as well as his wife, whom it would be expected was very proud of her husband for turning his life around. Shortly after getting the bookkeeper job for the Home Mission Board, Carnes moved the family from Cartersville, Georgia, to a small house in the Grant Park section of Atlanta to be closer to work. And soon after, when he was named treasurer, he moved his family out of the Grant Park section into the West End portion of the town, a notably more economically elevated part of Atlanta. In every recognizable way, Clinton Carnes' life was on the way up, and his family couldn't have been happier for their father and their husband to be leading the way. So it may come as a surprise, with this sort of encouraging trajectory going on, that the next part of Clinton Carnes' story is so unbelievable. And it's unbelievable because it is inexplicable. To this point, I've never found any source that has put the following events together in anything like a sequential story. So as you're hearing this, bear in mind that these events have been put together long after they occurred, and at the time that they occurred, the individuals involved had nothing approaching the kind of knowledge that we now have. As it's said, hindsight is 20/20. As the new treasurer of the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention, Clinton saw that it was incumbent upon him to become an active member of a Southern Baptist church. Now, importantly, up to this point, there's no recognizable indication of any religious activity or convictions in his life, the only exception being the passing detail that while he was incarcerated under the alias George Harris, he indicated his religious preference as Methodist. But a few blocks from his house, in the increasingly uptown residential district of West End, Atlanta, was the Capitol Avenue Baptist Church. It had only been recently built in 1900, and it was on a corner lot with unlimited potential. The pastor, Dr. William Henry, or better known as W.H. Major, had been in Atlanta since 1914 and had established himself as one of the staples in the city with the new and strategically positioned Baptist Church. He was a childless widower with years of pastoral experience, and Dr. Major devoted himself to the ministry and was quite effective in it. Capitol Avenue was soon listed as one of the 10 largest churches in Georgia in terms of finances, and it had an average membership of 1,137 souls in 1926. Now, as Clinton had never been baptized, being raised in either an unreligious or non-credo Baptist tradition, Dr. Major baptized him upon his applying for admission at the church in 1920. Dr. Major described Carnes as being, quote, one of the best church members we ever had, saying, quote, he was kind to the poor, a liberal contributor to the impoverished, and one of the most valuable members of the congregation. W. Gaines, who was an attorney for the Home Mission Board, was also a member of Capitol Avenue Baptist Church when Carnes arrived. He was a very active Southern Baptist. He took part in his legal work as a representative of the Home Mission Board from time to time. He wrote a history of his own church, and he also published in the Baptist Argus and elsewhere before being elected vice president of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1922. Even he spoke of Clinton Carnes, saying he is one of the most businesslike and progressive members of the church. Soon, Carnes was made a deacon of the church and was entrusted with serving as the chairman of the Finance Committee. For after all, if he could handle the financial ongoings of the entire Home Mission Board, surely a single church would be a walk in the park. Carnes also began regularly trading in the stock market, establishing a reputation as an expert speculator of stocks, and he became very active in local charities, establishing himself as a recognizable figure in many of Atlanta's most prestigious clubs. He was a member of the Druid Hills Golf Club, the Ansley Park Golf Club, the Atlanta Athletic Club, which was frequented by John Heisman. He was a member of the Exchange and City Clubs. He became a 32nd degree Freemason, a Knights Templar, a Shriner, and a member of the Knights of Pythias, which I had never heard of before this. I had to look that up. It's a rather exclusive group. From the outside, everything was looking shipshape in early 1920 for the now 41-year-old Clinton Carnes. He began introducing himself as C.S. Carnes in this era, and yet it was in June of 1920 that C.S. Carnes made a trip to Florence, South Carolina to visit the small Palmetto Bank and Trust Company. Now, this wouldn't have looked out of usual in any way to those hearing of it through the grapevine, as Clinton Carnes was in every way responsible for establishing accounts in each of the states in which the Home Mission Board had a reason to operate. In fact, he established such accounts all across the nation, from Massachusetts to New Mexico, and even in some North American nations near the U.S. like Cuba. But what was significant about his trip this time was the opening of the account in June 1920 at the Palmetto Bank and Trust Company, where he was opening an account that would become the account in which he would shelter all of his secret money. He opened an account with them for the Home Mission Board as well as a personal account, but rarely moved funds in or out of the Home Mission Board account. He spent all of his time regularly moving funds in and out of his personal account at the Palmetto Bank and Trust Company. Now, nobody except him knew about this account until December 28th of 1928. And so it was that only 6 months after officially beginning his job as treasurer of the Home Mission Board, C.S. Carnes opened the bank account where he would hide the embezzled money that he was going to steal. Now, early on, there was no sign or reason to believe that anything nefarious was going on. The Home Mission Board had an outside company that came in to do third-party audits of all of Carnes' work on their accounts every single year beginning in 1920. The CPA they brought in to do the audit was named J.H. Drury, and he reported every single year between Carnes' beginning in 1920 and his termination in 1928 that he found Carnes' accounts to be true and correct, with various statements about how that all his receipts and disbursements for the period are correctly stated, correctly kept, fully accounted for, and found in proper order. And yet, there were some who began to look with a curious eye at C.S. Carnes. In 1921, only a single year into his time as treasurer, Carnes visited a church called Druid Hills Baptist Church in the ritzy Druid Hills neighborhood of Atlanta. The pastor was a former corresponding secretary of the Home Mission Board, Dr. F.C. McConnell. They had been meeting in a rickety shack for several years and were now building a massive edifice that would dominate the neighborhood. It continues to do so today. The chairman of the deacons at Druid Hills Baptist Church was a young Louis D. Newton, and he, along with several of the other deacons, were responsible for counting and reporting the weekly offerings. One week, Newton recalls, he and the other deacons collected the offerings and found that C.S. Carnes had dropped a $1,000 check designated for the building fund in the offering plate upon his visit. Newton took the check to McConnell, as they were both fully aware of what Carnes' salary was at the Home Mission Board. At this time, he was making about $4,000 per year. McConnell quietly took the check and returned it to Carnes, telling him that he couldn't possibly accept a check of such a large amount from someone who simply does not have that much money to spare. He thanked Carnes for his kindness, but refused to accept the donation. Upon returning, he and Newton simply exchanged looks and wondered about what Carnes was thinking to drop such a large amount when he could certainly never afford to do so on his salary. And one could imagine their surprise when only the next year, in 1922, C.S. Carnes undertook to build a new home in the Druid Hills community. The house was described as a handsome hollow tile and marble villa at 1296 Fairview Road Northeast. It was valued at $50,000 in 1928, which factoring for inflation would be about $940,000 in 2025. Located well back from the street, the house was red brick with hollow tile trimmed in marble. The entire driveway was solid marble, as well as the window sills and the door sills. It had 100 feet of road footage and 200 feet of depth, and it was perfectly landscaped from front to back with dogwood trees and rare shrubbery all perfectly placed. They furnished the home with all brand new furniture, as Mrs. Carnes commented to neighbors that they were, quote, putting everything in their old life behind them and being sure that in this new home there would be very little to remind them of the past. Of course, she never mentioned their divorce or their remarriage or his prison stunt. Neighbors assumed that she was referring to their time in poverty. This $1 million marble villa built by a man with a salary of $4,000 per year caused those living and working in Druid Hills to tilt their heads. How could a man who had 2 sons of college age and a stay-at-home wife possibly afford a $50,000 home on a $4,000 salary? Newton recalled it and explained that although many wondered about this, it was never addressed because, in his words, you don't just go ask a man, are you really able to build a house like that? Now, to their credit, alongside his work with the Home Mission Board, Carnes had a lot of other irons in the fire. He had started a real estate company called the Phoenix Realty Company, which probably named as a cloaked homage to his own story of having risen from the ashes of a destroyed life, and this could have explained his ability to front money. He also appealed to his ability as a wise stock market trader, and he began compiling large holdings of real estate in Florida and Georgia and the Carolinas. By October of 1928, the New York Times reported that his real estate holdings alone, catch this, his real estate holdings alone, valued at $3,357,193.71. Factoring for inflation, it would be the equivalent of over $63 million in 2025. So you truly cannot overstate how widespread this man's reach was in terms of finances. He did deal in the stock market quite a lot. At one point, the Atlanta Constitution published a list of all of the stocks that he owned, and the total number of stocks was in the thousands. They were valued in the hundreds of thousands. And in addition to his stock market speculations and his real estate properties and his real estate company's earnings, he was also asked to serve as the director, secretary, and treasurer of the Franklin Mortgage Company, where undoubtedly he gained contacts that helped him procure backdoor entrances into several deals that he otherwise would have never been able to financially access. Additionally, he served as the president of the Automatic Car Lock Company, which mass-produced locks for rail car doors, and he was also a primary shareholder of the company which at the time was leading the way in innovations related to electric refrigeration. So it's not quite as simple as just saying, oh, those around him should have known that on a salary of $4,000 it was impossible for C.S. Carnes to become a multimillionaire in 6 years. There were other things that would play a part. Yes, he was flamboyant in spending money. He would drop $1,000 checks in area church coffers on a whim. He erected a $50,000 villa in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the fastest growing city in the South. Yes, he had 4 automobiles in the 1920s, when a car would cost you about a quarter of your annual wage. He also employed a full-time chauffeur just to drive him in his automobiles. He employed a cook and a housekeeper to assist his wife at home, and he fully funded both of his sons' educations. So yes, he had a lot of money going around. But when we state all of this in this way, we must again return to the fact that hindsight is 20/20. We have the benefit of seeing it all laid out at one time. We look at this and we say, how in the world did they not see what was going on? And yeah, that's fair to ask in any case, but it's also fair to defend the people surrounding him. They thought of him as a charitable and philanthropic person. They did not know he had a criminal record. They heard about his real estate investments and his stock market speculations, his presidencies over multiple successful and innovative businesses. They simply assumed he was massively successful in these ventures. Working for the Home Mission Board, they must have thought, was for him more or less a charity. Surely a $4,000 salary annually meant less than nothing to a guy with this sort of money. So they just assumed the best, even though their minds warred against their hearts in believing what they were seeing. Now, people who weren't all that close to the scene were actually more able to recognize that something was wrong here. One of the first to recognize this was R.G. Lee, who in 1924 raised the issue about C.S. Carnes, quote, living well above his means. Now, Dr. Lee was a respected man, and it was noted that he had said this, but also people nearby thought that he was simply not familiar with the situation and unaware of all of Carnes' other ventures. But even R.G. Lee was not the first to be suspicious of Carnes. Before him, Eel Harling, who was a board member of the Home Mission Board, said that he became suspicious of Carnes when he first moved to the west end of Atlanta from Grant Park, which he had only recently moved to from Cartersville. These suspicions were heightened when the Carnes family, whom he considered already out of their depth in West End, moved again to the prestigious Druid Hills Villa. Harling watched as Carnes expanded his social activities and almost overnight went from being a virtual laborer to an aristocrat in the highest circles of Atlanta. So in 1925, when the Southern Baptist Convention created the Cooperative Program, which unified the giving of thousands of Southern Baptist churches into one collective movement that funded most of the various Southern Baptist causes, including the Home Mission Board, Harling saw a real problem on the horizon. He expressed his concerns with another member of the board that oversees the Home Mission Board. He told them that he had an issue with Carnes and that he thought that there was something fishy going on, and this other member agreed and joined Harling in the concern. These two men, the other man always being unnamed, raised the prospect before the board of canceling Carnes' unlimited authority in financial matters and bringing more accountability to the position of treasurer. But disappointingly, no action was taken by the board. Now, this inaction was difficult to explain in later years. Dr. Pat M. Neff later questioned Harling as to why nothing was done if he truly communicated these concerns to the board, and he was unable to give a satisfactory answer. The only proposed reason for why the board would not want to take such steps is because of the approach of Dr. B.D. Gray, who was the executive secretary of the Home Mission Board at the time. Dr. Gray had been directing the Home Mission Board for over 20 years, ever since he took the position in 1903. In 1902, F.C. McConnell, remember this is the pastor of Druid Hills Baptist Church, had resigned the position, and Gray, who was at that point serving as president of Georgetown College in Lexington, left that job to come and take the position at the Home Mission Board. And Dr. Gray had prided himself from day one on his disbelief in micromanaging. He wanted the Home Mission Board to be run quickly and effectively, and for churches and other Home Mission Board funded organizations like hospitals to be able to procure funding as needed without having to sift through yards of bureaucratic red tape. And to be fair, that approach worked for a very long time, and it made the Home Mission Board very effective. But his work has largely been forgotten because of the Carnes defalcation. Now, why Dr. Gray's methods were problematic will be explained in a few moments. For the time being, let's stick with the sequence and stay in order. It's 1926, and this seems to be the year that fortune's wheel turned on C.S. Carnes. See, this part of the story takes some piecing together, and it appears that at some point in 1926, there were individuals from Carnes's past who recognized him in the positions that he had gained himself. Carnes himself later claimed that it was first guards at the federal prison who knew of his term of service there that threatened to expose him if they did not receive payment from him constantly with increasing sums of money. He claimed that these guards who were still employed at the penitentiary informed other guards who had lost their positions at the prison of this situation that they had engaged in with Clinton Carnes, and the guards who had recently been fired also began contacting Carnes with blackmail demands. Later on, he even claimed that former convicts with whom he had served time had reached out demanding and forcing him to pay various sums totaling a huge total, lest he be revealed. Now, whether all of this is true or not is up for speculation, but it does appear that in 1926, something definitely became a problem for C.S. Carnes. Neighbors noted that his wife withdrew from all of her intimate friendships and became very concerned with her husband's business affairs. And by the end of the year, on the 11th of December 1926, Carnes traveled 3 hours south to Dooley County, Georgia, to legally designate his son Samuel as power of attorney over his estate. After having all of the paperwork drawn up and legally standardized in Dooley County, Samuel then took the paperwork to be filed in the Fulton County records, which made more sense because that was the county in which they lived. The rationale for driving 3 hours away to draw up the paperwork would seem to be so that no one would know that Carnes had done it. And as time slipped on, Carnes's habits became even more unpredictable and inexplicable. His travel took over much of his life, and people had a difficult time keeping a handle on him. He had 3 offices just in Atlanta alone, one at the Home Mission Board offices at 804 in the Wynn Clotton building, another at the Phoenix Realty Company at 1005 in the Healy building, and another at the Franklin Mortgage Company located in the same building, the Healy building. Now, with that said, it wasn't unusual for him to be missing from time to time, as he could be at any one of his various jobs. One day, in 1927, he came into the office at 804 Wynn Clotton to turn in some time working for the Home Mission Board. But as he entered, he ran into a 19-year-old girl from Happyville who was working as a secretary in the building for a neighboring business. Striking up a conversation with her, he discovered that the young lady, Miss Lois Griffin, was an aspiring movie star who said that she was looking for a chance to make her big break. Well, by July 1927, C.S. Carnes had financed Miss Griffin to take a trip to New York City, where he'd arranged for her to have a part in a movie with Edna Murphy. Now, that name might not mean anything to listeners today, but suffice it to say that in the era of silent film, Edna Murphy was named the most photographed movie star of 1925. So arranging for a never-before-heard-of teenager from Happyville, Georgia, to be in a movie with Edna Murphy was an unbelievable thing to pull off, and somehow C.S. Carnes managed it. Upon her return to Atlanta, Carnes arranged for her to go live in Hollywood and actually signed a contract with her wherein he agreed to send her $250 a month, or $4,600 a month in modern equivalency, to keep her taken care of. In exchange, the contract stipulated that she would give him a percentage of her earnings once she made her big break. She arrived in Hollywood on Christmas Eve of 1927, and admittedly, when I read this, I thought what you're probably thinking. Ah, yeah, a guy in his mid to late 40s suddenly starts sending loads of money to a college-age girl to fund her dream of being an actress. Yeah, I think we all know what's going on here. But then I kept reading, and I discovered that Carnes had also contacted an older Atlanta woman named Louise Pope, who was older in the sense that she was older than Lois. She was in her 50s. And he asked Louise to move to Hollywood in order to chaperone the young Miss Griffin. And not only that, but Carnes asked Mrs. Pope to also take under her care a young Norwegian girl that he had met named Sonia Nordia, who also aspired to movie stardom. So Carnes paid for all 3 of these women to go live in Hollywood, and for Mrs. Pope to act as an agent and a chaperone for Miss Nordia from Norway and Miss Griffin from Atlanta. And so on New Year's of 1928, if you've been keeping up, C.S. Carnes is juggling a lot of knives. He claims very believably to be under the pressure of blackmailers who are shaking him down for large sums of money in exchange for not revealing his felonious past to his employers and family. And simultaneously, he's sending the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars every single month to Hollywood to finance the dreams of several women who are aspiring to movie stardom. And this all while he's working as the president of at least 3 different companies, the treasurer of 2 to 3 different companies, a stock trader, a real estate mogul, a deacon and a treasurer of his church, and of course also a husband and a father, as on occasion he did find time to be at home. His wife enjoyed inviting church friends over for dinners, and they described him as enjoying more than anything to just sit outside in his well-landscaped yard under the dogwood trees, building birdhouses and homes for the squirrels. Sometimes he'd just sit and watch the squirrels and the birds in the houses that he'd already built. One neighbor said that he and his wife would spend most evenings walking around beneath the dogwoods, appearing to take tours of their own yard. So altogether, C.S. Carnes' home life appears to have been rather sanguine, but all the while the walls were crashing down around him, and everything was about to fall apart. And the worst thing is, he knew it. Unaware of the absolute desperateness of their treasurer, the Home Mission Board gathered for a board meeting in 1927, and Carnes requested that he be given authority to borrow funds in the name of the mission board exclusively on his signature, without approval from any other officials. That is to say, without consulting any of his superiors, he could simply get loans on the name of the mission board by signing his signature. He explained that there were times in which the board urgently needed money, and he wanted to save time by acting on behalf of the board by himself. And inexplicably, the request was unanimously granted. Now, it is fair to say that this request is in alignment with the mentality of Dr. B.D. Gray, but it was probably also understood as by the members of the board as being something that was mostly needed. The Southern Baptist Convention as a whole was in a very difficult position in the aftermath of the $75 million campaign. This campaign had concluded in 1924, and if you're not familiar with it, it was an attempt to raise $75 million for Southern Baptist mission work following World War I. Most of the Protestant denominations had discovered during World War I that Americans had a considerable amount of expendable money because they had purchased war bonds during the war. And so the Southern Baptists were actually kind of late to the party on this, but they got in right in 1919 with the $75 million campaign, and Southern Baptists did pledge over $92 million to be given over the course of the next 5 years. The problem was, there came the Panic of 1919, which is sometimes called the First Red Scare. It was a moderate economic depression that hampered giving. And so although they had pledged $92 million, the Southern Baptist Convention over the next 5 years only received $60 million. Now that's not a huge issue at the face of it, because that was actually more money than the Southern Baptist Convention had ever received over any 5-year period. The problem was, the entities had begun by expecting $75 million, and some of them had acted as if they were going to receive $92 million, and they had gone into debt, expecting that that money would be there in 5 years to pay it back. So it was, even though the Southern Baptist Convention had received more money than it had ever had, it concluded the $75 million campaign in more debt than it had ever been in before. So 1924, of course we're ushering into 1925 where you have the advent of the cooperative program, was an era in which the Southern Baptists were really afraid of financial turmoil. Now, yes, the cooperative program helped alleviate these fears to some degree, but there was still a great deal of trepidation over how Southern Baptists would pay their way out of this hole without ending present mission works altogether. And one way that the Home Mission Board assisted with this was through a series of church loans that they would offer at reasonable interest rates to Southern Baptist churches. And the way that this worked was a church in the Southern Baptist Convention could get a loan at a low interest rate through the Home Mission Board. The Home Mission Board would procure the loan at an even lower interest rate from a bank. And so the church would pay the Home Mission Board at, say, a 5% interest rate, and the original loan would be received by the Home Mission Board at a 2% interest rate. So the church pays 5% to the Home Mission Board pays the loan back at 2% to the bank and keeps the other 3%, And the church saves money because they get a better interest rate than they could get by themselves. The Home Mission Board makes money on the interest, and the bank makes money on the lower level of interest that they're getting paid on a wide scale by the Home Mission Board that has thousands of Southern Baptist churches in its constituency. So everybody wins, right? It's a great system. It really was a great idea. And Carnes explained that in order to get these loans for churches and other causes, he needed to be able to act quickly and get the loans more or less on demand. He didn't have any room for red tape. And to be fair, he wasn't really lying. That was true. This had also already been something that he was experienced in. In 1927, Dr. Jacob Lee White was the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Raleigh, North Carolina, and he was working hard to build a new sanctuary for the church, and had even managed to procure the funding to do so, beginning construction on the magnificent new building that year. But in January of 1928, it became very clear that the church was not going to be able to make the mortgage payments. And so Dr. White began writing to anybody and everybody that he thought could help, including John D. Rockefeller, but no luck. That was until he wrote the Home Mission Board. He received word back from a young C.S. Carnes, who was the treasurer of the mission board, who informed him that they would be glad to help him. And on the 12th of February 1928, the issue seemed resolved when the church dedicated their newly completed auditorium that had been funded by a loan received at the hands of C.S. Carnes through the Home Mission Board. So there is truth to what he was saying, but on the side, Carnes certainly used this unregulated authority for his own gain in ways that I'm going to try to explain in a few moments. Now, as with all previous years, the business year of 1927 and 28 concluded with an audit of Carnes' accounts. In May of 1928, J.H. Drury, the independent CPA who audited his accounts for the entirety of his tenure, once again stated that everything in his work was absolutely shipshape. Now, in 1928, there was a mandated internal review of his accounts that was to be done by a member of the board of the Home Mission Board that year. So somebody on the HMB was supposed to go in and perform a third audit of their accounts, the first being done by Carnes, the second being done by Drury, and a third being done independently by another member of the board, just to make sure that everything was being done correctly. But for some reason, it simply was never done. In June of 1928, Carnes made the list of Atlanta's men of affairs, who was sort of a who's who of Atlanta. Now, Atlanta's at this time a city of 250,000 people, and the list was under a dozen. So this really indicates how truly massive Clinton Carnes was in the Atlanta area. By the way, he wrote his own biography for this sketch. It's very, very pompous. It's important, as we prepare to delve into the fall of C.S. Carnes, though, to acknowledge how highly regarded he was when his life fell apart. I mean, Lois Griffin, for example, said that when she was working in the office where she first connected with Carnes, he was always on a pedestal in Atlanta. She went on to say he was looked up to as one of the wealthiest men in town. Many a time, my employer has wished to have had as much money as Carnes, and I used to sit back and just think of how grand it would be to have as fine a home as he had. But behind the facade, Carnes was out of money. In fact, in July of 1928, he took out a second mortgage on his Druid Hills estate, and he only got $5,000 for it, which he took directly to Palmetto Bank in Florence, South Carolina. He must have known that his scheme was about to fall apart, because this seems to have been his last attempt to keep things going, if only for a little while longer. As it would turn out, he managed to scrape together another $2,000 to add to the $5,000 second mortgage, and he made his final deposit at Palmetto, a $7,000 deposit, which was the last that he'd ever make to the bank. The game was finally ending. So, all of this leading to this question, how did Carnes do all this? Well, it wasn't nearly as complicated as one might think. The Home Mission Board operated on several levels, many of which could have been financed by the incoming funds which were collected on an annual basis through regular gifts and through the newly developed cooperative program. In 1927, for example, he was responsible for the reception and conveyance of roughly $800,000 without any trust or loans included. In truth, without any loans whatsoever, the Home Mission Board could have operated without much loss in its regular offerings. The issues came with the repayment of debts that had been assumed during the $75 million campaign. These debts were to be paid through payments that were nowhere near the total balance owed, of course, so what C.S. Carnes would do was three things. First of all, he would use all of the incoming funds to pay for the regular expenses. things like missionary salaries, loans to churches, administrative fees, etc. And this would run the regular fund of the Home Mission Board nearly empty, but he would keep just enough in it to secure that no one would ever be aware of that. Secondly, he would secure loans on behalf of the Home Mission Board under the guise of paying out loans to other churches or expanding mission work in areas under the Home Mission Board's shadow. Now, in reality, he would already have paid out the loans to other churches or expanded mission work by using the funds that had come in that year through the regular account. And so these loans were extra money on top, and he was able to take the vast majority of them and make the minimum payments required to maintain the other loans that had been assumed in the aftermath of the $75 million campaign. So let me walk through this at a way that can be understood verbally. He would get a loan for, say, $50,000, and he would have a required $5,000 in minimum payments on loans that he already had outstanding. And so he would take $5,000 of his $50,000 and make the minimum payments. He'd take another $5,000 out of his $50,000 loan and give it out to churches as actual loans so as to appear to be doing his duties correctly. That would leave $40,000 in this brand new loan outstanding, which he would pocket for himself. Then he would take the money that he had embezzled, invested in real estate, the stock market, businesses, or sometimes aspiring movie stars, and have the intent of paying back the missing funds after the investments had matured, so as to keep anyone from ever knowing that he'd ever done any of this at all. Now, the plan, on the face of it, sounds like it would work. It's a ridiculous plan. It's a phony plan that no sound-minded, sane person would ever do, but it does sound like it might work. So what messed it up? Well, two things. Number one, the investments did not mature. He ended up losing money on things. For example, his family and friends gave him over $100,000 to invest in the stock market, and he loved to brag about that, his father being one of them. His father was listed as a rather wealthy man up to the very end of his life, when it's said that he lost all of his savings in what's only referred to as a, quote, bank investment failure. His father's widow, Sarah Frances Walker Carnes, didn't specify that the elder Carnes had entrusted his savings to his millionaire financier son, but given that the bank investment failure was said to have been rather recent and the elder Carnes died in 1929, it's very likely that C.S. Carnes was responsible for his father's investments failing. And we should add that Carnes also probably lost all of his own savings and investments in poor investments as well. The second thing that probably went wrong was that we can't rule out the very real possibility that Carnes was being blackmailed. Regardless of how much he might have exaggerated this as an excuse for his behavior, and he certainly did exaggerate it. At one point in 1928, he says he'd been blackmailed for over 10 years. Well, 10 years from 1928 to 1918, he wasn't even working for the Home Mission Board yet. He was barely out of prison, so that doesn't make any sense at all. He definitely exaggerated this to some degree, but it's also most likely the case that there was some blackmailing going on. So as investments failed to mature, and Carnes would have found himself unable to replace the money that he'd stolen for these investments because he was being blackmailed, he was probably forced to take a lot more money than he ever intended to, getting nothing in return. But he also probably thought that as long as he could continue getting loans to pay the minimum payments on the other loans he already had, he'd never be discovered. And surely, as somebody who had the ability to go to any bank in the United States as a representative of the Southern Baptist Convention's Home Mission Board, he'd never run out of banks and he'd never run out of loans. Well, that was until July of 1928. See, Carnes that month mailed his last $250 check to Lois Griffin in California, and he was obviously scraping the bottom of the barrel. In late July, he made a trip to Chatham, Virginia, and he visited a small bank called the Chatham State Bank. It's a little community between Lynchburg, Virginia and Greensboro, North Carolina, and the Chatham State Bank was a small bank that would likely think it an honor to gain a client account as reliable as the Home Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. However, when C.S. Carnes asked them for a loan of $100,000, they had to ask for time to check and see if such a loan was even possible for a bank their size. Now, Carnes simply didn't have the time to linger and wait, and so he left thinking that the venture had truly failed. Little did he know that even though this had failed, this one meeting would change his entire life. Carnes returned home with no money in hand, and he spent the next few weeks trying to figure out a way that he could find the money required to keep everything afloat, evidently needing something in the ballpark of $100,000. The secretary who worked for Carnes at the Phoenix real estate office reported that upon his return from Virginia, he spent the next several weeks worrying terribly about something. She said, "I thought he looked very badly for several weeks, and I even told him so. But he passed it off and said everything was all right. But he certainly looked as though he was under some terrific strain." She went on to say, "I think something was driving him almost crazy with worry, maybe even fear." So on August the 13th, Carnes made one last-ditch attempt to save himself. He made a 250-mile trip to Columbia, South Carolina, attempting to make loans in the name of the Home Mission Board, but again he was rejected because of ongoing economic financial stringency. In both cases, the loans had not been rejected because of distrust of him or poor credit. The loans had been rejected simply because of circumstances that wouldn't allow the banks to give the loans that he had requested. But the reason for denial was a non-factor for Carnes. The fact of the matter was he needed the money and he couldn't get it. So Carnes returned from South Carolina on August the 13th and told his personal secretary that he was to have private visitors the following day at the Phoenix Realty Company office. Now, the secretary later reported, "This struck me as unusual, because nothing like it had ever happened before. Mr. Carnes had always been exceptionally open and frank in all of his business affairs, so I was surprised, but I respected his wishes and didn't return to the office that day. I never saw the people, whoever they were, that he was expecting." Now, whoever these strangers were has never been adequately explained, not even by Carnes. He implied later that they were blackmailers who finally made their consummate threat to reveal him for who he was. But in any case, they arrived before noon on August the 14th and stayed for quite a long meeting, leaving that afternoon. Carnes sent word that afternoon to Dr. B.D. Gray that he would be taking a trip to Raleigh, North Carolina on the morrow, that is, on Wednesday the 15th, for personal reasons. And after concluding business there, he said that he might take a trip to Boston. But in any case, he told Dr. Gray that he'd be back in the office on Monday the 20th. Then, he disappeared. Now, it wasn't uncommon for Carnes to be away on trips for several days at a time. Nobody wondered a bit about the fact that he was gone between Wednesday the 15th and Monday the 20th. Somewhat humorously, even when he failed to show up on Monday as promised, nobody really raised any big questions. Tuesday and Wednesday also came and went without anybody raising any red flags. After all, his accounts had been successfully audited 2 months prior, and all the reports had been positive. He was supposed to be in a city that the Home Mission Board had only recently loaned funds to a major First Baptist church to build their new sanctuary, so everybody just expected that he would be delayed in his business matters over in Raleigh. But on Thursday the 23rd, there was a scheduled executive meeting of the board, and when he didn't appear for that meeting, people began wondering what might be going on. The board reached out to his family at home and discovered that they also had no knowledge of his whereabouts. The family, understandably, took the concern of the mission board as a real sign that there was a problem. They feared that Carnes had been kidnapped, or even worse, by some who wished to rob or extort him because of his access that he had to large sums of money. His personal secretary was asked for information and reported his recent high levels of anxiety, and then recalled the mysterious meeting with strangers on the 14th. She told the Atlanta Constitution, "I'm afraid that he broke under the strain, whatever it was, while away from home, and he's probably sick among strangers at this very moment." Members of the mission board became curious when told about this mysterious meeting with strangers at one of his private offices, so they returned to his home mission board office at the Wynn Clawton building and decided to open some of his recent mail to see if there were any signs of extortion. Instead, what they found was a letter from a bank they'd never heard of, the Chatham State Bank in Chatham, Virginia. The letter regretfully informed Carnes that they were forced to decline his request for a $100,000 loan due to the fact that they, as a small rural bank, were not able to loan out such a large amount at one time. Now, members of the board were very confused when they read this, as they had no knowledge of any project that would require such a large amount on such short notice. So a special meeting was called to be held on Friday, August the 24th, to attempt to discuss what was going on. At that meeting on Friday the 24th, the board laid out further information that they had found in the mail addressed to Carnes that indicated that several banks across the country were calling for payment or adjustments on loans that were up to $100,000 or $200,000 that the board had no awareness of. Some banks had offered to renew loans if you would extend them to larger amounts. And none of this information was made available to the public, but it had now been 9 days since Carnes left Atlanta and 5 days since he was supposed to return. The board was more confused than ever, and his family was very worried. And so, they announced that Clinton S. Carnes was officially missing. In the meantime, the board also took action to try to figure out what was going on with all these banks which were asking for payments, adjustments, or renewals. As J.H. Drury had just 2 months previously given a stamp of perfect health to all of the board's accounts, they chose to call up A.N. Patton, who was a CPA employed by a nationwide firm called Ernst & Ernst. Now, this firm at the time was one of the top 10 largest accounting firms in America, and Patton got to work performing his own audit of the accounts on Monday the 25th. That day, even though he couldn't explain how or why, he immediately reported that there was at least $400,000 missing from the Home Mission Board's accounts. Now, this shortage was immediately printed in the New York Times, and by Tuesday the 28th, reporters from the Atlanta Constitution were receiving calls from individuals, specifically guards at the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, informing them that the missing person that the Home Mission Board was searching for had previously been a convict under their watch by the name Convict Number 6237. The Constitution, in a now unprecedented show of journalistic professionalism, spent 2 full days contacting what were at the time known as Bertillon experts. Now, in these early days of official mugshots, the Bertillon system created certain metrics by which a person could be positively identified by such things as bony parts of the body, head length, head breadth, length of middle finger, length of left foot, length of forearm, so on and so forth. So on the 29th, it was discovered that a person matching the exact description of Carnes had served 2 separate imprisonments, one in Atlanta and one in Missouri. He was also wanted for theft in Indiana, where he had left his hotel bill and all of his luggage. That came back up. And still, the Constitution feared to report such a thing without absolute assurance. So finally, on Thursday, August the 30th, the Bertillon experts looked over mugshots of the imprisoned man against photographs of C.S. Carnes and confirmed beyond any doubt that this was the man that they were looking for. As the day was late, they rushed to the Wynn Clotton building to make the Home Mission Board aware of what had been discovered and confirmed. Late in the evening of Thursday, August the 30th of 1928, Luther Rice Christie, better known as L.R. Christie, the president of the Home Mission Board and pastor of the Ponce de Leon Baptist Church in Atlanta, received the news that his treasurer was a twice-convicted felon who had defrauded almost every employer that he had ever worked for. He was expectedly dumbfounded by this revelation and naturally didn't think that it could possibly be true. However, the Atlanta Constitution brought overwhelming evidence showing their work in checking this over for the last 2 days, and he was forced to believe it. Christie knew he needed to act fast. He immediately made 3 phone calls. First, he made a call to Judge Arthur G. Powell, who was a highly respected judge in Georgia who had acted as the attorney for the Home Mission Board for several years. He asked Judge Powell to come to the office immediately and advise him on what they were about to do. Christie then called George W. Truett, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Truett was in Virginia visiting his daughter at the time, and he advised Christie that any further action should have a representative of the Southern Baptist Convention's Executive Committee present, so as to ensure that Southern Baptists don't get the idea that the Home Mission Board is trying to do anything behind closed doors without oversight. Christie asked Truett to designate a person and have them come immediately. Finally, Christie called Colonel Benjamin Lamar Bugg, better known as B.L. Bugg. Bugg was the president of the Atlanta-Birmingham Coast Railroads. He was a deacon at the First Baptist Church of Atlanta, and most importantly, he was a member of the Home Mission Board's Administrative Committee. He would serve as a representative of the Home Mission Board apart from Dr. Christie. George Truett paid a call to his close friend Louis D. Newton, who was the editor of the Christian Index and the chairman of the deacons at Druid Hills Baptist Church, and asked him to act as a representative of the Southern Baptist Executive Committee and report on all that occurred with as much detail as he could for later members of the committee to read. So it was on August the 30th at 10 p.m., these 4 men, L.R. Christie, Arthur G. Powell, B.L. Bugg, and Louis D. Newton, convened at the Wynn Clotton building in downtown Atlanta. Judge Powell recommended that they bring in local detectives that he could call on quickly to be present, so as to be able to open safes and locked boxes without destroying evidence that could be important in future investigations. Upon the arrival of 2 detectives, these men entered the offices of C.S. Carnes and began using screwdrivers to pry open his desk drawers and lockboxes. they discovered an entirely separate book of bank statements and deposit slips from what they had previously produced for Drury and Patton to do their audits of the accounts. This book that they discovered, as well as many other files, revealed the criminal transactions and true balances of C.S. Carnes. By midnight, the men were convinced that Carnes had stolen what they could only then describe as a lot of money. As the men prepared to leave shortly after midnight, Colonel Bugg spoke briefly with Christie and Powell. They all realized that Louis Newton, who lived in Druid Hills, would pass right by the Carnes residence on his way home. So after a moment, Bugg turned to Newton and said, "We think we owe it to Mrs. Carnes to go out there and tell her, and we want you, as you go home, to break it to her." Newton arrived at the Carnes residence shortly before 1 in the morning, and the lights were on inside. He went up and rang the doorbell, and Mrs. Carnes was, as he described, a bundle of frenzied nerves. Thinking her husband had been found, she asked, "Tell me, Mr. Newton, what is it?" He proceeded to tell her that not only had they learned that Clinton was a twice-convicted felon who had defrauded his previous employers, but based on the information they had at hand in only that one office, they believed that he had now absconded with just under $1 million from the Home Mission Board. As Newton continued speaking, he noted that she seemed to be an odd mixture of surprised and unsurprised. He said, "She was just a lovely lady, but she said to me, 'I knew something was happening. He couldn't be driving expensive automobiles and building this house on the salary he was making. I never knew what it was, but I knew something was going on.'" And yet, the legitimacy of Maud Carnes' ignorance of her husband's crimes is called into question by the fact that Newton later says that he asked her if she was aware of her husband's previous incarceration, and she indicated that she was unaware of it. Now, this is demonstrably false. And further, interviews with the neighbors indicate that while in early years Maud would invite neighbors over to their home, over the last 2 years, since 1926, when things started going bad for Clinton, she had withdrawn from her intimate friends and had, quote, given herself up to taking care of her home and sharing an interest in her husband's business affairs. So it's very difficult, if not impossible, to believe that Maud had no awareness whatsoever of her husband's business dealings. On Friday, August the 31st, news began to spread that the treasurer of the Home Mission Board had not gone missing, but instead had run away with some enormous sum of money. Immediately, 2 Atlanta businessmen, Harvey B. Downing and Earl S. Redwine, contacted the Atlanta Constitution to confirm that this Carnes was certainly the same man who had been incarcerated in Atlanta, as they reported having visited him while he was incarcerated and having frequently seen him on the streets of the city in the years afterwards without ever establishing a connection with him. They made a point to note out that they had not seen him in over a month, though, and one must admit in reading this, it's quite odd that immediately upon his name and face being popularized, so many people, such as guards and old friends, suddenly came out of the woodworks to confirm that he was in prison and that they remembered him very clearly, despite that being over a decade previous. It adds some degree of credibility to Carnes' claim that he was being blackmailed. But for a moment, there were still doubts about what was going on. Some people speculated that he had fled the country by going north. Smith Gambrell, a prominent citizen of Atlanta, stated that he had sat with Carnes on a train going from Birmingham to Chattanooga on August the 17th, 2 days after he disappeared. And this report threw everyone for a loop, because he had told all of his associates that he was going east to Raleigh and then possibly up to Boston. His chauffeur confirmed that he had dropped him off at the train station heading east for Raleigh, but here Mr. Gambrell said that he was west in Birmingham, headed north up to Chattanooga. Now all of this was throwing everyone off, and all the while, although no one knew this, C.S. Carnes was in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He spent a few weeks there at the Randolph Hotel before establishing an office at 1211 Broadway with the intention of starting a new business under the name Frank J. Lewis. Evidently thinking less of the plan, though, he moved late in August to Star Lake, Wisconsin, where he spent a few days fishing. And all the while, as he's enjoying himself on his little getaway fishing trip, he was also enjoying no small bit of good press. The Birmingham Post published quite a long article entitled "Come Back," wherein a citizen of Birmingham, the city, by the way, where Carnes had originally been charged and sentenced to imprisonment in Atlanta, called on Carnes to, quote, tell the blackmailers to go to hell and come back home to his wife and children where he could be forgiven as others who have sinned. Now, this article is painfully unaware of the reality of the situation. It seems to think that Carnes had disappeared because he was embarrassed of having his criminal past revealed. The author is entirely unaware that he had absconded with close to $1 million because the day that this article was published was the same day that the Home Mission Board publicly revealed how much he had taken. But the author nevertheless wrote in the morning edition of the Birmingham Post, "The people of the church should forgive him for a wrong which long ago has been righted. He has handled millions of dollars. Last year alone, 800,000 passed through his hand." Little did they know. He has a wife and 2 sons in college. He lives in the exclusive Druid Hills section of Atlanta, Georgia. Men look up to him. Women respect him for the quality of his character, and children love him because of his kind heart. But on August the 15th, strangers entered the office of Clinton S. Carnes. There was a conference, and then Carnes vanished. I'm sorry, I have to laugh reading this. "This is the challenge to your Christianity, men and women of the church. He sinned 14 years ago. He paid in full the price that he owed to the law, and now must flee and hide his face for those who are his loved ones. Who are we that we should stand aloof from the man who sinned and who paid? Who are we that we should cry out, 'I am holier than thou'? Who are we that we should point fingers of scorn at the sons of Clinton S. Carnes and say, 'Your father sinned'? Their father sinned indeed, but did you ever sin, neighbor?" Somebody knows Clinton S. Carnes' hiding place. Go to him and say, "Come home, Clinton S. Carnes, and come not cringing like a thief. Come with your head up and look your neighbors in the eyes without faltering. Come back to your good wife and to your sons. You sinned? Who hasn't? Tell the blackmailers to go to hell." Now, that would be a powerful message. Again, if it wasn't released the same day that the Home Mission Board publicly announced that he had stolen nearly $1 million. But that turned out to be the end of the positive publicity that C.S. Carnes was going to receive. For while he was in Wisconsin enjoying himself, the Home Mission Board back in Atlanta was scrambling to figure out how to announce a public statement about what had just happened. Monday, September the 3rd was Labor Day, so they reconvened on September the 4th, with the Executive Committee of the Home Mission Board being called on to convene along with George W. Truett, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. Many who were there had devoted their lives to the Southern Baptist Convention. There's men like Austin Crouch, Charles W. Daniel, and B.D. Gray, as well as many others. And they spent several hours reviewing details and preparing a report for the public in the Southern Baptist Convention. Mr. Patton, representing Ernst & Ernst, gave a verbal announcement and report as to what he had found. He wasn't prepared to give a written report yet. And even his verbal report kept the board in session from 8 a.m. until 3 p.m. without a break. At 3 p.m., they took an intermission set to reconvene at 4 o'clock, and reporters were standing outside waiting for a public statement, and although they asked questions, the men would not answer questions yet. One of those reporters was Louis Newton, representing the Christian Index, and he wrote, just based on what I saw, "Upon emerging, the mission board had faces that were very long and eyes almost tearful. They knew what the world at that moment didn't know, that the board's treasury had been wrecked by the fugitive." When the board reconvened at 4 o'clock, they were asked to take the information they'd been provided and put together a public statement. Rather than addressing specifics on the financial turmoil right then and there, they chose to publicly address their plans to move forward. The Home Mission Board wrote, "The Home Mission Board realizes that it is utterly unable to finance itself under the present condition. We therefore ask the assistance of the Executive Committee of the Southern Baptist Convention in such ways and under such conditions as the Executive Committee may suggest. We pledge ourselves to the fullest cooperation in this, no matter what it may involve." Taking up their call for assistance, President Truett appointed a 3-man subcommittee of members from the Southern Baptist Executive Committee to recommend a procedure. These 3 men were Charles Daniel, Pat M. Neff, and J. E. Dillard. They made the suggestion that there be 3 things done. First of all, the Home Mission Board must communicate profound sympathy in the calamity that has overtaken it. Secondly, the board of the Home Mission Board must be reorganized and rehabilitated. Third, a committee of 3 members from the Southern Baptist Executive Committee and 3 members of the Home Mission Board's Executive Committee should be appointed to set these 2 prior efforts in motion. The Home Mission Board put together L.R. Christie, who was its president, W.H. Major, who was its secretary, and by the way, remember, he was also the pastor of Clinton Carnes' church, and F.S. Etheridge. And the executive committee of the Southern Baptist Convention put forward Austin Crouch, W.L. Barnes, and C.W. Daniel. The first act of this six-man committee was to call for the retirement of Dr. B.D. Gray, who was the executive committee, or the executive secretary of the Home Mission Board. They were very clear that he was not linked to any crime in any way, but it was nevertheless largely considered his fault that this was not caught or stopped. They next asked Arch C. Lee, the executive secretary of the Georgia Baptist Convention, to step in and serve as the executive secretary of the Home Mission Board. They then organized, that is, they fired and appointed new members to the board of the Home Mission Board, and they contacted creditor banks to renegotiate all of the outstanding loans, placing holds on operational costs within what they knew at the time to be their income limits. So years later, Ronald Tonks made a comment that the process that they went through could be summed up today simply by saying, everyone got fired. On September the 4th of 1928, it could be said this was the day that the lights went out in Georgia for everyone connected to the Home Mission Board. Everyone got fired. Meanwhile, back at the farm, on September the 7th of 1928, only 3 days later, C.S. Carnes arrived in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, fresh off the train from Milwaukee. And mysteriously, the first thing that he did when he went to Winnipeg was he entered several banks and purchased safety deposit boxes. He was again operating under the name Frank J. Lewis, and he was reported by those who saw him to be tall, dark, smartly dressed, and presenting as a prosperous businessman. While going through the process of purchasing these safety deposit boxes, he began conversing with those in the banks about who he might contact if he wanted to start a business in Winnipeg. They asked him what kind of business he was interested in starting, and he responded that since Winnipeg was in the center of the great Canadian wheat, bran, and other grain belts, he believed the city would be the ideal location for a large cereal breakfast food manufacturer, as all the necessary ingredients could be obtained from local granaries without having to pay cost for shipping before the product was manufactured. Having collected a few noteworthy names, he lodged himself at a rather expensive hotel called the Hotel Corona, and began day after day working to network with those he had been referred to. Before long, he became friends with a rather wealthy and well-known family who lived on the west end of Winnipeg, in a residential area known to home the prosperous of the city. They had an unwed adult daughter in the family who was seen taking very long and seemingly romantic walks through the city with Carnes over the next couple of weeks. Back in Atlanta, the hits just kept coming. On 9th of September, a secret warrant was issued for the arrest of Clinton S. Carnes, with Judge Luther Z. Rosser and John Hudson, the assistant to the Solicitor General, being anxious to grant L.R. Christie's request for it. The Solicitor General, John Boykin, received letters, telegrams, and phone calls from all over the country, giving tips as to the location of the missing men. A description of Carnes was published in every major newspaper, with a $5,000 reward for tips leading to the arrest. Arch Cree reported that day after day, checks were pouring in from charitable donors who desired to see the Home Mission Board saved. Along with that, they filed a lawsuit against Joel Hunter and Company for endorsing Carnes and sending him to them when Carnes was a twice-convicted fraudster. But Hunter and Company filed a demurrer, saying that the Home Mission Board could maintain its lawsuit, but only against Carnes, who, being in absentia, was now represented by his son, Samuel A. Carnes, who had power of attorney over all of his father's possessions. The Home Mission Board felt that Hunter and Company were liable for the amount of the damage because they failed to do an inquiry into the record of Carnes before endorsing him to the board. But the courts ultimately concluded that a person is not a guarantor of an employee's conduct simply because they recommend the employee to an employer. M.E. Dodd also arrived in Atlanta that week and began preaching throughout the churches of that city and surrounding cities, trying to raise the confidence levels in the fidelity of the Home Mission Board so that churches would give sacrificially to the board and save it from bankruptcy. He preached that in the last 10 years, the Home Mission Board had been entrusted with over $400 million and had only, check that, only lost $1 million. Thus, he argued, this is his quote, "The loss is equivalent to losing 25 cents out of $100. So let us rejoice in the good which the other $99.75 has done, and let us stand ready to give freely. Our great and needy causes must not be allowed to suffer because one man from 4 million of us went wrong. Southern Baptists still have church and denominational properties worth more than $300 million as they stand. We have the resources in our people's intelligence and character, and we will overcome this difficulty and go forward with our great work. Somehow I don't think that argument would be as compelling today, but it was an unbelievable thing because it worked as a true sign of solidarity. The churches in Atlanta alone provided more than $40,000, which paid for the Home Mission Board to operate for another month just on their offerings right there. On the other hand, not all Baptists were so supportive. The North Carolina Baptist State Convention publicly declared that they would not be undertaking any organized effort to repay the debt incurred, which they publicly announced was more than $2 million. Arch Cree responded to this by saying that their figures were without foundation and premature. But this statement represented the feeling of many others who were less inclined to save the mission board. And to their credit, reports in the early stages were wildly different. Some said that Carnes had taken well over $1.5 million. Some said that he had taken not quite $1 million. And their faith was hardly reassured when the newly reorganized Home Mission Board Executive Board named their new acting treasurer, Dr. B.D. Gray, who was largely considered responsible for this entire fiasco in the first place. And if you can believe it, it only got worse. On the 11th of September, the Constitution revealed that it had followed tips from across the nation, implying that Carnes had used the Home Mission Board's financing to send several young ladies across the country to work in the movie industry. These young ladies, seeking fame and stardom, were more than happy to give interviews complete with staged photographs about their financial relationships with C.S. Carnes. Lois Griffin even produced the contract that she had signed and the checks that he had sent her for interviewers to view. Now, only 3 women were interviewed about this: Louise Pope, Sonedia Naridia, and Lois Griffin. But these 3 ladies alone accounted for over $15,000 that Carnes had sent. And terribly, Louise Pope, who was far less transparent than the young aspiring stars were, commented to the Associated Press that while she had no desire to be connected with Carnes or provide any additional information, she did want them to know, quote, "You have not scratched the surface yet." They asked her to clarify if she was implying that she had knowledge of other dealings that Carnes had, and she confirmed that she did in fact know of other dealings that he was involved with, but wouldn't comment any further. Now, this appears to have been the straw that broke the camel's back for his wife. Remember, 14 years earlier, she had divorced him, but had remarried him shortly after he emerged from prison after it appeared he was turning his life around. And over the last 2 years, she had withdrawn from friends, probably aware of some of his illegal activities, even if not completely. But now she's become aware, through publications in the largest newspaper in a city of 250,000, that her husband has been financing 20-year-old girls to go become movie stars in Hollywood. It was reported that upon receiving this news, Mrs. Carnes had a breakdown. And after the 11th of September, she became unable to see relatives or visitors at all. She lived in their home in Druid Hills for some time before ultimately moving away to a neighboring city where she and her sons escaped the notoriety and were largely never heard of again. On the 26th of September, the Home Mission Board released its official indictment of Carnes with a total attached. They charged him with embezzling $88,666.86, which painfully would come to represent the only crime that he would ultimately be convicted of. Although the audit was not yet complete by Mr. Patton of Ernst & Ernst until the 4th of October, the news from the auditors was not good in the meantime. They reported in October that Carnes had been responsible for misallocating, morally we would call it stealing, but legally it was called misallocating, $909,461 of Home Mission Board funds. However, they found that while they could go through the process of indicting him for all of the money, the jail time would exceed no more than 5 to 7 years in prison, regardless of the amount. So the $88,666.86 was sufficient for their capacity to prosecute to the maximum amount. This was their chief problem. The majority of what C.S. Carnes did was perfectly legal. He had been given permission by the Home Mission Board to personally receive and distribute loans on their behalf without any other oversight. They had authorized him, without any requirement to get permission from anyone else, to go to a bank and take out a loan in the name of the Home Mission Board, having the check for the amount loaned written to C.S. Carnes. They also authorized him to do that so that he could distribute funds more quickly. Thus, they didn't require him to get permission from anyone or to check with anyone or even make them aware that he was doing so. So technically speaking, what he did was perfectly legal. It was immoral, but it was legal. And beyond that, he had borrowed money from so many different states that the laws in Georgia would not be in effect to prosecute him for the theft of funds in a state such as Oklahoma. And the legal fees to be paid in order to hire lawyers and carry out the lawsuits in each respective jurisdiction was going to run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was not a good case to be made against Carnes, and even if there was, it would be financial suicide to pursue it to the fullest extent of the law. So when they found that he had in fact embezzled $88,666.86 from the Home Mission Board's bonds that were written not to Carnes but to the Home Mission Board by name, they pounced on the opportunity and waited for an arrest. Now, last we heard from C.S. Carnes, he was wooing the daughter of a wealthy Winnipeg man, and he was living with the family, working to network his way into a cereal company. On Monday, September 24th, an Atlanta woman who so happened to have recently moved to Winnipeg noticed the accent of a man as being not only American, but American South. After briefly speaking with him about what he was in the city for, he told her he was establishing a cereal company, she got his name and went on with her life. Only later did she recall an Atlanta man matching his description who was wanted with a $5,000 bounty for tips leading to his arrest. The Atlanta Constitution had described Carnes beginning on September the 1st as being 6 feet 1 inch tall, weighing 147 pounds, slim built with dark complexion, good teeth, black hair and brown eyes, a straight nose and thin face, and a peculiar mark, a scar on his right cheek. Now, in the meantime, Carnes had grown out a mustache and begun parting his hair differently. He was not in any way resemblable to the photos and descriptions that came out of Atlanta, except for this key distinctive of having a scar on his right cheek. The woman reached out to the Chief Chris Newton of the Winnipeg Police Department and lodged a tip about a man that she had met, one Frank L. Lewis, who evidently had changed the middle initial from what he used in Milwaukee. She said that he had been in the city for about 2 weeks, and Chief Newton assigned 2 detectives, James Melville and G.R. Burnett, to follow Mr. Lewis until further confirmation could be received. They wired the Atlanta Police Department for information on the person, and after 4 days of waiting for photographs to be conveyed and consulting with their own Bertillon experts, they determined that the individual going by Frank L. Lewis was indeed C.S. Carnes. And so it was on the 28th of September, 1928, after a month and a half on the run, 2 Winnipeg detectives approached John L. Lewis on the streets of Winnipeg in the downtown section during the mid-afternoon crowd rush. They were not in uniform, but were dressed in street clothes when they approached him, but they said that he was wanted at headquarters. Carnes initially protested, saying that he had no business at the police station, but he soon realized that it was less of a request and acquiesced to their directions. Upon arrival at the Rupert Street Police Station, he was fingerprinted and confronted with the Bertillon measurements that had arrived that morning from St. Paul, identifying him with C.S. Carnes, the wanted man from Atlanta. Upon this presentation of the evidence, he admitted that he was Carnes. Chief Newton asked if he wanted to fight extradition or if he wanted to waive his right and be taken back to Atlanta to stand trial in the United States. Carnes stated that he would waive his right to a Canadian trial and would consent to extradition to America. He was immediately taken to his cell, where he was not allowed to speak or be spoken to per Canadian law. He requested an attorney, but this was refused. The next morning, he appeared in a formal court appearance wherein the Canadian police would be charged with legally holding him in place for the police of Atlanta, Georgia. He asked one of the detectives to make a phone call for him. He said, "Would you call a business associate of mine here in Winnipeg? We were meant to enter into negotiations over my cereal company today, and I'd appreciate if you would inform him that Mr. Lewis has left town and will have to cancel negotiations." Now, upon his arrest, police were sent to collect his effects from the home where he was lodged. The family that he was staying with was completely shocked. They had only good things to say about him. They told local reporters he was a perfect gentleman, quiet and rather pleasant to converse with. And this is a word that comes up repeatedly when people are describing Clinton Carnes. Pleasant. Neighbors said he was pleasant but distant. This family called him quiet but rather pleasant. Lois Griffin actually says it a little differently. She said he was kindly and interesting to talk to. The gist of it is this. Clinton Carnes was apparently a tall, good-looking, dynamic, interesting person who was kind, pleasant, and easy to talk with. And this sort of dynamism and good looks got him through a lot in life. The room that he was staying in had few personal effects with the exception of a couple of bags of luggage and lots of newspapers from all over which had clearly been well read. However, reporters do not mention that these newspapers spoke of him. He did mention that at some points he had heard people reading about himself in the paper and felt a peculiar feeling when he had heard somebody mention the Carnes fiasco. But in these papers that were found in his home, they were papers that didn't mention him. He was simply reading local events in the mindset of establishing himself as a well-informed citizen of the area. The chief also mentioned that when he was arrested, he had a few $1,000s worth of traveler's checks written to John Lewis on his person. Dr. L.R. Christie was performing a wedding when the call came that Carnes had been arrested. John Hudson, who was the assistant to the Solicitor General, and R.T. Tolbert, the deputy sheriff of Atlanta, were sent to Winnipeg by train to collect and escort Carnes back to Atlanta. They arrived and walked him onto the Canadian National on October the 3rd of 1928. He wasn't aware until that very morning of when he would be leaving, as Canadian law prohibited police or attorneys in Canada from speaking with individuals meant to be tried in the United States. So this means that he spent 8 days in the Winnipeg jail in complete silence, unknowing of when he would be sent back to Atlanta. Upon the arrival of John Hudson and R.T. Tolbert, he was reported as looking very nervous. He had a few days of scruff grown out, and his first statement was that he was willing to repay the city of Atlanta the cost of transporting these two men and himself, a gesture that was taken as an attempt to simply create sympathy in the South. Hudson responded that Carnes would repay the public the way that all prisoners do, by hard labor. A special prosecutor had been appointed in Atlanta to take the case, former Governor Clifford Walker. He heard that Carnes had waived his extradition trial and said that he wanted to get this thing through with, and Walker responded to the press, "If Carnes wants to get this business over with as quickly as possible, he is going to be accommodated." Now, the flurry of information that came out while Carnes was on the train ride back to Atlanta is hard to process. It's often contradictory. Some said that he was cordial with the detectives who escorted him, even being allowed to take off his handcuffs and play cards with the officers while he spoke with the newspapermen. Others, on the other hand, report that he had a terrific hatred towards his escorts that required Hudson and Taylor to, quote, keep him in irons all the way in complete silence. Another person noted that every once in a while, Hudson and Taylor would attempt to break the monotony with a question, only to have Carnes invariably break loose in a temper. He was reported by some to have maintained his air of dignity, while others said that he became violent when reporters and photographers even came around him, being a bundle of nerves shot to pieces. Whatever happened on the various train rides as they transitioned from the Canadian line to the Dixie Limited line that took him on to Atlanta, there is one interview that interrupts the storyline, and it was granted to the New York Times. In this front page article, Carnes claimed, quote, "I finally got into such a fix that there was nothing else I could do." He also reported while in transit that the truth about this whole business is not and will not ever be known. He maintained steadfastly that much of this was a misunderstanding, and he even said that if I had been given 2 or 3 weeks, everything would have been fine. He stated elsewhere, "I could have straightened out the whole affair with the mission board in 3 weeks had I not been forced to flee Atlanta." Upon his return, Carnes met at Atlanta's Union Station at 9 a.m. on the 5th of October with what was called throngs of curious townspeople who had gathered to see him brought back to Atlanta in shackles. One New York Times correspondent described him as looking pale, haggard, and nervous. He maintained his composure enough to hide his manacled hand, which was cuffed to Mr. Hudson under an overcoat. Carnes immediately demanded 2 months before being charged with anything to do his own audits of the accounts, distrusting the audits that had recently been published by Ernst & Ernst, reporting that he had stolen $909,461, divided between $683,334.14 from the Home Mission Board's General Fund and $226,126.86 from the Church Building Loan Fund, with an average of roughly $100,000 being stolen every year during his time as treasurer. It appears that Carnes was completely disconnected from reality. He spoke as if he had simply gone on a business trip and returned to Atlanta with nothing changed. He referred to making plans to speak with certain leading figures in Atlanta, discussing certain business and banking matters with figures who would now have nothing to do with him at all. Upon having his attorney assigned to him, a very prestigious one at that, named William Schley Howard, he began realizing how little he'd be able to share if he really wanted to get out of this situation. He wouldn't be able to tell anyone why he left in the manner that he did, or where he had gone immediately upon his disappearance, and most importantly, what he had done with the money that he was alleged to have stolen. Now, this last problem, what became of the money, remained a mystery forever. When he was en route to America on the train, he one time asked to access his luggage. The detectives asked what he wanted. He said he wanted to change his clothes. They offered to get the clothes for him, and he simply said, "Never mind." Later on, it was discovered that in his luggage were a series of odd-looking keys that were later identified as keys that belonged to safety deposit boxes in banks in Winnipeg and elsewhere. Mr. Hudson assigned Thomas Howell Scott to finding all of the assets that Carnes had, and Scott revealed that he believed that Carnes had hidden a treasure of roughly $700,000 in safety deposit boxes between Chicago, Milwaukee, Star Lake, Wisconsin, and Winnipeg. But that sum of money has never been found. His assets had been turned over by Samuel, his son, in an attempt to rectify his family's debts with the Home Mission Board. His wife and sons had left the home that he'd built in Druid Hills locked up and desolate for weeks when he arrived in Atlanta. His properties were being auctioned off at prices that literally everyone involved considered inappropriate. For example, one of his Atlanta properties, located on Spring Street, had valued at over $100,000, but was sold in October of that year for $15,000. The Home Mission Board saw that they were never going to get their full amount of money back this way, and Carnes' lawyer, Mr. Howard, considered it robbery because it reduced the amount of money that his client could be said to have returned to the board in the end. But the properties were nevertheless sold for expeditious timing rather than an established minimum, and buyers took advantage of the opportunities. All in all, the liquidation of everything that he ever had, which had once been evaluated at over $3 million by the New York Times, produced only $235,678.35. Compiling all of his liquidated assets, the $3,000 in checks that he had on his person at the time of his arrest, and the $50,000 bond that was indeed paid out by the United States Fidelity and Security Company that had ensured that he was a reliable employee all those years ago, the total amount repaid by Carnes was around 1/3 of what he had stolen. And all of this, nevertheless, did not change the fact that the legal issues surrounding the nature of his crimes produced real difficulties in terms of conviction. After spending several months in what they called the Tower, which was a colloquial term for the Fulton County Jail, Carnes appeared in the Fulton Superior Court before Judge Virulin B. Moore. There were 20 indictments pending on him, only one of which, the $80,000 embezzlement charge, was actually being pressed at the moment by Judge Arthur G. Powell, who was acting attorney for the Home Mission Board. Powell stood alongside Dr. Christie across the courtroom from Carnes and his younger son Robert. His ex-wife Maud and his older son Samuel did not appear. It was noted that Maud never again visited Clinton and never saw him after the 15th of August 1928 when he disappeared. On the 5th of February 1929, a plea of guilty was entered upon the agreement that Carnes would serve the state maximum for a crime of embezzlement, which was 7 years. Powell stipulated that if Carnes asked for parole at any point prior to the full 7 years, they would press charges on the other 19 indictments and carry out that process in every state. The presiding judge, Virulin Moore, stated, "You're getting off lightly, perhaps too lightly. But I've considered the recommendations of Dr. Christie and Judge Powell, and I'm going to agree to this sentence." The whole trial took less than 30 minutes inside the courtroom. Dr. Christie said that since Mr. Carnes is now approximately 55 years old, it occurs to me that a minimum sentence of 5 years for a man of his age is the equivalent of a much longer term for a younger man. Powell echoed the sentiment, saying, as Mr. Carnes is approximately 55 years old, a sentence of 5 to 7 years would probably mean almost the same as a life sentence. And they were almost right. Upon being transferred to a hard labor prison at Milledgeville on the 6th of February 1929, where he was to work on a chain gang for 7 years, Carnes was almost immediately sent to a tubercular camp at the prison farm where he would soon be diagnosed with tuberculosis, which rendered him totally disabled. The only time he would leave the tubercular sanatorium in the next 4 years was when he was summoned to Atlanta to testify in a case wherein the Home Mission Board was seeking insurance entitlements he was meant to get for disability. The insurance was supposed to pay him for his disability, for medical disablement, but it didn't want to because he was in prison, and they felt that it was the responsibility of the state to care for medically disabled prisoners. They ultimately did win the case, and the Home Mission Board received a $100,000 total from his life insurance company. Contrary to what everyone involved agreed to, on the 12th of March, 1933, having spent only 4 years and 1 month of what was said to have been a mandatory 7-year sentence in prison, C.S. Carnes was set at liberty on parole due to his health and his good behavior. He was to remain on parole until the completion of his 7th year of term. Now, some desired to fight this when it was discovered, but when Carnes was almost immediately admitted to the State Tuberculosis Sanatorium in Alto, Georgia, all desire to prosecute simply went away. On the 21st of May, 1933, it was publicly reported that C.S. Carnes had moved to New Mexico on the advice of his physicians and with the permission of state authorities, who believed that the hot, dry climate would help his health. To the surprise of everyone, Carnes would go on to live for another 17 additional years, moving all over the American West. At one point, in April 1947, he was arrested in Denver, Colorado, for drunken and reckless driving. He would have been released, but he was unable to pay the $204 traffic fine and was consequently lodged in the county jail awaiting a check to arrive in a few days. He seemed to still have a good sense of humor about things, joking with the reporters about what people would think if they knew the treasurer of the Home Mission Board had been driving drunk. He denied being drunk in any case, saying that he was driving another man's vehicle and was unfamiliar with its operation. When asked about the treasure he was said to have gotten away with, he said that he had been living for the previous 14 years since release from prison on insurance annuities, and had even in his time as treasurer only received a little of the money that he was accused of taking, saying, "I just took the rap." To be fair, he was unable to pay a $204 fine after all. On the 31st of July, 1950, Clinton Samuel Carnes died of a cerebral hemorrhage at the age of 72. He was at home where he lived at 57 South, 8th East Street in Salt Lake City, Utah. At the time, he was living with a woman he was not married to, whose name is listed on his death certificate as Mrs. M. Baxter. He was buried on the 2nd of August, 1950, in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Salt Lake City. When C.S. Carnes was tried for his crimes, the records of the then-closed Palmetto Bank and Trust Company in Florence, South Carolina, reflected that he had made over 1,500 deposits to his secret bank account between June 1920 and July 1928. The deposits totaled $1,835,000. When he disappeared in August 1928, there was $965.71 left in the account. The Southern Baptist Convention publicized Baptist Honor Day on November the 11th of 1928 in an attempt to reclaim the losses from his theft. They raised $389,164.35, and this combined with the $235,678.35 he repaid through the liquidation of all of his assets made up $624,842.70 of the $909,461 that he'd stolen. There was still a leftover $284,618.30 outstanding, in addition to the initial debt that the Home Mission Board was in when he took over following the disastrous $75 million campaign. So it could be said that at the end of almost 10 years as their treasurer, Clinton Carnes not only did not end any of the debt that the Home Mission Board was in, but left them with another $250,000 in debt, and that after some major fundraising efforts. Now, many did not believe that the Home Mission Board would ever get out of this debt. Indeed, when the Southern Baptist Convention met in Memphis on the 11th of May, 1929, two separate motions were made, one to abolish the Home Mission Board and another to liquidate its assets and combine it with the Foreign Mission Board to form a new Southern Baptist Mission Board, but both of these motions were defeated. The Southern Baptist Convention would trudge on, even though in 1929 they dove directly into the Great Depression. The debt of the Southern Baptist Convention would not be paid off until 1943. In the interim, the Home Mission Board had to cut funding to states that had established state conventions, such as the Oklahoma Baptist Convention, which reported feeling that the worst had come and had to fight hard against criticism that swept their churches. Mountain schools all throughout Appalachia, which were owned and operated by the Home Mission Board, were forced to be sold at unreasonably low prices, simply in an attempt to settle a debt quickly. Beyond the financial turmoil wreaked by C.S. Carnes on the Southern Baptist Convention, it is also understood that many people's lives were ruined and their legacies tarnished, thinking specifically of B.D. Gray, by what he did. But you may be surprised to hear that people died as a result of his actions. Two examples specifically, the first being Dr. F.C. McConnell, the one-time correspondence secretary of the Home Mission Board, who took Carnes' check back to him when he offered to build McConnell's Druid Hills Baptist Church. On the 12th of January 1929, amidst the Carnes defalcation fiasco, when things looked like they would never be repaid, McConnell had a sudden stroke and died in the front seat of Louis D. Newton's car. McConnell's family believed, and still believes, that he was stressed to the point of death over the fate of his beloved Home Mission Board as a result of what C.S. Carnes had done. Only 2 days after the death of F.C. McConnell, Samuel Gunter Carnes, that's C.S. Carnes' father, also died. His widow reported on her application for his military pension that he had been wealthy until a recent bank investment failure which cost him to lose all of his savings. And one can hardly imagine the shame that a father would feel knowing that his son was incarcerated in the Tower at Atlanta for embezzling $1 million from a Christian missionary agency. Along with the financial turmoil of losing all of his own savings, which were likely tied up in stocks his son had advised, C.S. Carnes likely played a primary role in the death of his own father. As we wrap this up, there is one detail that I did not mention earlier in this episode that I think is a massive lesson for everyone to learn. When Mr. Patton was brought on representing the nationwide firm of Ernst & Ernst to do an independent audit aside from what Mr. Drury had done over the previous 8 years, Patton reported that it took less than a day's time to figure out all that was lost, totaling $909,461. He commented publicly that he could hardly believe that the local auditor hadn't discovered it. Patton explained exactly what Carnes had done, saying, by carefully doctoring the books, Carnes made it appear that the Home Mission Board's available funds had not changed much, when in reality the funds did not exist. So, one wants to ask the question, why did not Mr. Drury discover this? Was he in on the scam with Carnes too? Well, actually, no. The reality was this. The Home Mission Board was based out of Atlanta and had always used Joel Hunter and Company as their CPAs and auditors. In 1919, when they hired Carnes from the firm of Joel Hunter and Company, and then made him the treasurer in 1920, the Home Mission Board considered it a conflict of interest to have Joel Hunter and Company, the former employer of their treasurer, perform the audit on the accounts that Carnes was overseeing. So they searched for another CPA in Atlanta. But an entity as large as the Home Mission Board doesn't have a ton of options as far as CPAs go, as not every CPA can handle accounts that large. In fact, in the aftermath of World War I, even fewer than normal were available. So, Mr. J.H. Drury, a local accountant and notably a Southern Baptist, volunteered to do the Home Mission Board's independent audits at a fee of only $200 until they could find a larger firm to perform the audit. the Home Mission Board considered it sufficient to have a former CPA in Carnes and a current CPA in Drury looking into their books independently of one another every year, especially when periodically they would have a third auditor come in, as they were supposed to have done in 1928, but didn't. So when Mr. Patton of Ernst & Ernst discovered the errors, he was shocked at what Mr. Drury had missed. But ultimately, Mr. Patton commented, "Drury, the local CPA and a good Baptist, only charged $200 for a job Ernst would have charged $2,000. So, you get what you pay for." And what's only worse is that even the comprehensive audit that Ernst & Ernst did in 1928 when Carnes went missing still only cost the Home Mission Board $7,000. So in summary, if the Home Mission Board had paid $2,000 for an appropriately qualified CPA in 1920, or had paid $7,000 at any point between 1920 and 1928 to have an overhaul of their financial system done, they would have saved themselves $1 million by 1928. You get what you pay for, indeed. Thank you for listening to the Baptist Directory. My name is Dr. Michael Schultz, and if you've never listened to this on a podcast platform, such as Spotify or Apple Podcast, did you know that you could do that? All of the episodes that you're watching on YouTube are also available in audio format to watch or listen to at your leisure as you're going about your day. Inversely, if you've only ever listened to this on a podcast platform, you're missing out, because the YouTube edition of these is really, really rich. I always put a lot of work into having images of all the things that we talk about, and the length of these makes them turn into full-length documentaries. So if you've never looked up the Baptist Directory on a podcast platform or on YouTube, whichever way that you prefer to listen, try the other out once in a while. See if you like it. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.